Will silver and gold save you during times of a financial crisis? I'm Rick Bloodworth. This is the Common Sense Christian channel, and we're going to be looking at that very question today. But before we get into the precious metal part of the discussion, I do want to start with a proverb by King Solomon. He said this, "Whoever trusts in his riches will fall, but the righteous will flourish." There needs to be some precaution taken on our part, I believe, just as far as being a reasonable person. We can see the times, and it's important for us to understand the times and know what to do. That's just part of being a prudent person. It's part of being a Christian. But there comes a point where we get carried away with our physical preparations, and sometimes we lose sight of the one who can really help us in all of this. And so I want to temper this discussion with this notion. There are certain physical precautions that I believe we can take that will help us get through difficulties, including financial crises, in a much better way. But if our perspective is not that of a Christian, if our perspective is not that God will take care of us if we're faithful to Him, then I think we might be wasting our time. But if your perspective is right, if you're putting God first, if you're putting Christ first, and you're just trying to be as prudent as you can with the resources that God has given to you, well, I believe that's something that we all need to be doing. And so that's what we want to talk about today. Again, let's go back to this question. Will silver and gold save you during times of financial turmoil? And maybe the best place to begin with is the Great Depression. That's something that people have talked about for many years. It's something that even though none of us lived during that time, or very few of us lived during that time, and those that did certainly wouldn't have been old enough to have remembered a big portion of it, we look at this as the seminal moment as far as financial crises, as far as financial turmoil. It's the Great Depression, isn't it? Well, let's go back and look at what silver was selling for as the Great Depression approached. Remember, the stock market crashed in October of 29. So let's go back to September. In September, silver was selling for 53 cents an ounce. Those were the days, weren't they? Well, by October of 1932, after the crash had hit and after the Great Depression started and really had been there now for years, silver was down to 28 cents an ounce. Now, it popped up from May to October of 1935. It got as high as 64 cents an ounce. So there was a period in there of about 4 months where silver was actually trading for higher than it did before the Great Depression started. But this 4-month period was an anomaly. After that, it dipped back down almost immediately, and it stayed down until December of 1945, pretty much the end of World War II. And in December of 1945, silver came back to 52 cents an ounce. And so when you look at it, just from a purely statistical point of view, you might say, well, it was just 53 cents an ounce in 1929 before the crash, and it took an entire 16 years plus to get back up to that point with a very brief period in between where it actually exceeded that price. But for the most part, it was trading below the pre-crash figures. And so the question is, did it help them? Just from an observational standpoint, if we're talking about silver bullion, the answer would be absolutely not. It did not help them. But think about what their money was at the time. If you'll recall, in 1932, as soon as FDR got into office, almost as soon, he declared a bank holiday, and he confiscated most of the gold in people's hands, at least the gold coinage in people's hands, and outlawed the holding of gold except for certain professions. A dentist could certainly use it. Others that needed it in their profession could have small amounts of it, and coin collectors could have old gold coins in their collection, but it couldn't be considered a hoard. And there was a pretty big fine that went along with that if you violated that. If you didn't take your gold coins and turn them into the bank, you could be fined or even imprisoned. So gold is pretty much out of the discussion. That's why we want to look at silver during this period of time. But silver was still the money of the land. And if you had had, let's say, $1,000 in silver at the time that the Depression started, well, think about this. In September of 29, when silver was selling for 53 cents an ounce, that meant that $1 of silver face value only had 38 cents worth of actual silver in it. And yet it traded for $1. And even in October of 1932, when it was down to 28 cents, and it just had 20 cents worth of silver per face value of 90% silver. Well, that seems like it's not holding its value, but again, you still had $1's purchasing power. And during the Great Depression, prices went down. This was, in fact, the Great Deflation in American history. There were other periods of deflation, but none so long and pronounced as the Great Depression. And in fact, that's why it's called the Great Depression. There was a period, again, in 1935 where it went up to 64 cents an ounce, but still, you only have 46 cents worth of silver in it, but you still have $1's worth of purchasing power. And all the way up to December of 1945, when it finally creeped back to the point nearly that it was in September of 1929, you still only had about 37, 38 cents worth of silver per dollar. But think about what that dollar would have purchased you back then. Prices were going down during the Great Depression. I don't know if you've seen that famous picture, but it's on Wall Street, and there's a sign on a very fancy car, one of the most luxurious cars of its time, and it said they would take $100 cash for that car. That cost probably over $1,000 at the time that this particular luxury vehicle was made, and back then $1,000 was real money, but you could probably buy it for about 10 cents on the dollar if you had kept your money. And certainly if you had kept your money in silver instead of in the bank, then you would have been able to have taken advantage of the Great Depression, because your money would actually buy a little bit more each year during that Great Depression. Some years it kind of held its own, but for the most part, you had more value in the middle of the Great Depression than you had at the beginning of it. And so would silver have helped during that financial crisis, the greatest financial crisis of American history? And the answer is it would have. Now, you might argue, no, the Civil War was even a greater financial crisis, and to a certain extent, especially if you were involved in the war, it would have been. But even then, had you held gold or silver during that time instead of the greenbacks or the Confederate currency, you would have been able to get all sorts of bargains with that gold and that silver, because gold and silver were very much in short supply. And that's true even back to the Revolutionary War, when they were trading the continental currency and it devalued to the point where it was almost worthless. Silver and gold still retained their value. Now let's kind of come up in history to a time that most of us will remember. It's called the financial crisis of 2008. And in 2008, 2007, 2008, a lot of things kind of came together, but it was a financial crisis that was spurred on, at least in great part, by the banks having trouble because they were investing in some pretty risky real estate instruments. And because of that, it nearly collapsed the market. And in a lot of areas of America, people lost their jobs. And many people lost their homes during this time. But let's say you were holding silver at that time. In February of 2008, silver was selling for $19.62 an ounce. By June, it had dropped to $17.65 an ounce. And in October, when the stock market crashed, silver dropped down to $9.28, at least on a monthly basis. I think the spot actually got down to $8.85 an ounce, and quite frankly, I was buying during that time. But think about that. It had nearly fallen in half from February to October of the same year. So did silver help people? And at the initial part of it, it did not help people. But as the financial crisis continued, by March of 2010, silver was back up to $17.50 an ounce on a monthly basis. And then in April of 2011, silver had gone all the way up to $48.70, nearly tripling from what it had been before the great financial crisis had begun, and this in just a period of about 3 years. And if you had bought it when the financial crisis officially began with the collapse of the stock market in October of 2008, well, you probably would have never lost any money on silver or gold. As a matter of fact, they would have just increased in value from that point, because October of 2008 was certainly the low point, not only for the stock market crashing, but it was the low point, actual physical price low point for silver. And so you would have done fairly well, going from $8.85 to $48.70. Well, that's nearly 6 times an increase. And of course, if you traded during that time or paid any attention to the charts from that time, you know that silver went down, and it went down rapidly after that point, but it never hit that $8.85 low again. And so the thing about it was that while silver and gold will temporarily have a dip during our modern day crises, and the reason for that is because that's very often the only asset that people have that's actually worth something. And so if their stocks fall and they get a margin call, they can sell their silver or gold and meet that margin call. Or they can sell that silver and gold if they've lost their job and be able to continue to pay their mortgage, at least for a little bit. But again, I want to get back to this point. Silver and gold were different during the Great Depression because they were the money of the land. Today, they are not. During the Great Depression, it was a time of deflation. During the financial crisis, it was a time of inflation. It was a moderate inflation, but it was still a time of inflation. And that's one of the reasons that I believe, that I have found, at least by investing in silver since the early 1980s, it holds its value well. When I first started investing in silver, I think it was about $10 or $11 an ounce, and it dropped at one point, I think in 1992, to less than $4 an ounce. And I can remember buying a monster box at that time because it just didn't look like it could get too much lower. Even if it went to zero, you weren't losing an awful lot of money. But people need these things because, in addition to the fact that they have historically been money, even if they're not now, they have historically also been something that has a demand. Certainly gold for jewelry and other items, silver for industrial usage, and you cannot do without silver when it comes to history. And now what are we finding today? The central banks have now made gold a monetary asset again. And in the United States of America, they've actually classified silver as a strategic metal. And so we can see that even the governments around the world are starting to pile in. And I believe that the reason that even though the retail side has slowed down as far as demand goes, the big boys, the governments, the industry, they are piling in on silver and gold right now, and that's kept the prices going up to record highs and actually staying at record highs. When silver went up to a little over $50 an ounce in 1980, it just stayed there for a day or two. It was above $40 just for a few days. And then when it went up to nearly $50 again in 2011, it only stayed there for a little bit of time. Maybe for a period of 2 weeks was it actually over $40 an ounce. But now what do we see? It's been at $40 an ounce for several months now. Over $50 an ounce or around that for over a month. And so we're starting to see a different reaction right now to something that many of us consider the beginnings of a financial crisis. And so, will it help you? Well, nobody knows for sure. Nobody knows exactly what anything is going to do. Nobody knows what a government will do as far as their laws. Nobody knows what the economy is going to do. But I believe there are certain signs that we can see. It's kind of like having a house. If you've got termites in the floor, you can predict that someday that floor is going to give way. And in a worldwide economy that just keeps getting into greater and greater debt, you can say, I think the economy has termites in it. I don't know how much longer the floor is going to last. Maybe it'll be 20 years, maybe it'll be 20 minutes. But if we can take some prudent action, not just in precious metals, but in stocking up prudently on things like food and different non-perishables that we can acquire now, probably at lower prices than we'll pay tomorrow, that's not a bad idea. Now, we don't want to tear down our barns and build newer ones and then just sit back and take it easy. We found out from the parable of the rich fool that didn't work out too well for him. God demanded his life because he wasn't using what he had in God's service. I believe that we are servants of God and that we need to use the things that we have in a responsible way. We are stewards of the possessions that God's allowed us to have. But part of that stewardship means making rational decisions. And right now, to me at least, after observing the economy for a number of years, it does appear that it's prudent to be stocking up a little bit on different assets, whether we're talking about food, whether we're talking about precious metals or other things that appear might be in shorter supply in the future, or at least at higher prices. If you and I can act prudently without getting carried away, I think we'll do fairly well, and we'll be able to help a lot of people along the way. But if we just close our eyes, or if we pretend that God does not want us to be good stewards when it comes to our physical assets, well, we might find ourselves scrambling for things with the rest of the population, and we'll be a hindrance instead of a help to those that we love the most. Will silver and gold help people in times of a financial crisis? I believe history has proven that it has in the past, and I think it's reasonable to think that it will in the future. But again, our primary focus should be on God and upon Christ. And part of that focus will include a reasonable stewardship with our physical possessions. And I think, at least for now, that silver and gold are part of making reasonable preparations for the future, so it wouldn't hurt to have a little bit on hand. Well, that's the video for today. Let me know what you think in the comments. I always enjoy your comments, but I do appreciate your watching. I hope we'll see you again next time. God bless.